Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the line between reality and nightmare becomes impossibly thin. I'm your host, and today we're stepping back over a century into the winter of 1912, to a place that time has tried desperately to erase from memory. Before we descend into this darkness together, I'd like to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across time zones, knowing that while some of you sit in bright morning light, others are alone in the deep hours of night, and perhaps that's fitting for what we're about to uncover. Our story begins in Dust Creek, Missouri, a name you won't find on modern maps, a community of roughly 200 souls nestled in the Ozark foothills, 23 miles from the nearest railroad station. In 1912, Dust Creek existed in a kind of temporal isolation, a place where 19th century customs still governed daily life, where superstitions brought from the old world mingled with the harsh pragmatism required to survive the American frontier. The winter of 1912 arrived early and with unusual cruelty. By November, temperatures had plummeted, and by December, Dust Creek found itself cut off from the outside world by snowdrifts that reached the second-story windows of the town's general store. It was during this isolation that something happened, something that would transform a small farming community into the site of one of the most disturbing and unexplained cases in Missouri's rural history. On December 8, 1912, 8-year-old Sarah Miller vanished. Sarah was the daughter of Thomas and Eleanor Miller, respected members of the Dust Creek community. Thomas operated a modest farm on the eastern edge of town, where the cultivated fields gave way to dense forest. By all accounts, Sarah was an unremarkable child, quiet, obedient, prone to wandering the woods near her home, collecting unusual stones and watching birds. Her schoolteacher, Miss Caroline Porter, described her as a gentle soul, perhaps too gentle for this hard world. The circumstances of her disappearance were, initially, tragically mundane. Sarah had gone to fetch water from the well behind the family's barn. When she didn't return after 20 minutes, her mother went searching. She found the water bucket overturned in the snow, its contents frozen. Sarah's footprints led toward the tree line, then simply stopped, as if the child had been plucked from the earth itself. The town mobilized immediately. Every able-bodied man joined the search, combing the frozen forest in organized lines, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. They searched for 3 days, 3 days of bitter cold, of howling wind, of hope slowly crystallizing into grief. Dr. Henry Whitmore, the town's physician, privately told Sarah's parents what everyone already knew: no child could survive 3 nights in that killing cold. But on the morning of December 11th, Sarah Miller walked out of the forest. She emerged at dawn, her nightgown torn and filthy, her feet bare and bleeding, her skin pale as cemetery marble. She walked directly to her family's front door and knocked, as calmly as if she'd simply been visiting a neighbor. When her mother opened the door and collapsed in shock and relief, Sarah reportedly said only one thing: "I'm hungry." The town celebrated. The local, Pastor Jonathan Hayes, called it a Christmas miracle. Dr. Whitmore examined Sarah and found her remarkably unharmed, considering the ordeal. Frostbite on her toes, minor lacerations, severe dehydration, but alive. Against all odds, impossibly alive. The celebration lasted exactly 4 days, because by December 15th it became clear that whatever had walked out of those woods looked like Sarah Miller, spoke like Sarah Miller, but was no longer entirely the child who had disappeared. Something had changed, something fundamental, something that would tear Dust Creek apart and leave questions that, to this day, remain unanswered. What happened to Sarah Miller in those 3 days? What did she encounter in the frozen darkness of the Ozark woods? And more disturbingly, what came back with her? To understand what unfolded in Dust Creek, we must first understand the world that shaped it. The year 1912 stands at a peculiar crossroads in American history. The Titanic had sunk just 8 months earlier, reminding the world that progress and technology were no shield against tragedy. New Mexico and Arizona had just become states, expanding the nation's borders. Yet in places like Dust Creek, modernity remained a distant rumor, something that happened to other people in other places. Dust Creek had been established in 1847 by German and Irish immigrants, drawn westward by promises of cheap land and new beginnings. The town's original name, according to county records housed in the Missouri State Archives, was Staubach, meaning dust stream in German, referring to the creek that ran dry every summer, leaving only a bed of fine, pale dust. By 1912, the community had anglicized the name, but little else had changed in 65 years. The town consisted of a single main street, unpaved and rutted, lined with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a one-room schoolhouse, a church, and Dr. Whitmore's office, which doubled as the town's only pharmacy. Most families lived on scattered farms within a 5-mile radius. There was no electricity, no telephone service, no connection to the outside world, except for the mail coach that arrived twice weekly from the county seat, weather permitting. The population was deeply religious, primarily Lutheran and Catholic, with a smattering of Baptists. Church attendance wasn't optional. It was the social fabric that held the community together. Pastor Jonathan Hayes had served the Lutheran congregation for 18 years. His journals, donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1967 by his grandson, provide invaluable insight into the community's mindset. In an entry from November 1912, Hayes wrote, "Our isolation is both our blessing and our burden. We are untouched by the moral decay of the cities, but we are also alone with our fears, with no authority to appeal to save the Lord himself." The Miller family occupied a middle position in Dust Creek's social hierarchy. Thomas Miller, aged 34 in 1912, had inherited his farm from his father. He grew primarily corn and wheat, kept a dozen dairy cows, and maintained a small apple orchard that had been planted by the original German settlers. His wife, Eleanor, aged 31, was known for her skill in herbal medicine, often assisting Dr. Whitmore with difficult births and childhood ailments. She kept meticulous records of her remedies in a leather-bound journal, which was later seized as evidence and remains in the county's sealed archives. Sarah was their only surviving child. Eleanor had suffered 3 miscarriages before Sarah's birth and 2 more after. In a letter to her sister in St. Louis, dated March 1911 and preserved in the Miller family papers, Eleanor wrote, "Sarah is my miracle, my one perfect thing in this harsh world. I watch her sometimes and fear that I love her too much, that God will punish me for such idolatry." Dr. Henry Whitmore represents the town's tenuous connection to scientific modernity. Educated at the Missouri Medical College in St. Louis, he had come to Dust Creek in 1895, fleeing, according to local gossip, some unnamed scandal in the city. He was 52 in 1912, a widower with no children, living in rooms above his practice. His medical logs, miraculously preserved and now digitized by the University of Missouri, reveal a physician caught between 2 worlds. He prescribed laudanum and quinine with the confidence of modern medicine, but his notes also record treatments based on folk wisdom, poultices of bread mold for infections, bloodletting for fevers, consultations with Eleanor Miller about the old remedies. In a particularly revealing entry from December 1911, exactly 1 year before Sarah's disappearance, Whitmore wrote, treated Johann Schmidt today for what he insists is a curse placed upon him by the widow Braun. Physically, the man suffers from nothing more than severe anxiety and poor digestion. But how does one treat a man's belief in his own damnation? I gave him bicarbonate of soda and told him to pray. Medicine and superstition, forever dancing their awkward waltz in this place. The winter of 1912 had been predicted by the farmers to be brutal. The woolly caterpillars had been unusually thick-banded, the squirrels had gathered nuts with frantic urgency, and the old-timers noted that the creek had dried earlier than usual that autumn. "When Dust Creek runs dry before October," went the local saying, "winter will make you wish you'd died." The first snow fell on November 3rd, and it didn't stop until April. By December, Dust Creek was effectively sealed off from the outside world. The mail coach stopped running. Dr. Whitmore noted in his log that his supply of essential medicines was running dangerously low. Food stores, carefully rationed, were still adequate, but the psychological weight of the isolation pressed heavily on the community. It was in this context, this perfect storm of isolation, superstition, and winter's merciless grip, that Sarah Miller disappeared into the woods. And it was in this context that the town would struggle to make sense of what she became when she returned. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we examine what Sarah became, we must understand what happened during those 4 days of Christmas miracle celebration, before the town's joy curdled into something else entirely, before the first signs appeared that something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. The county newspaper, the Osage County Courier, ran a brief story on December 19, 1912. The headline read, "Missing Child Found Alive, Dust Creek Celebrates Christmas Miracle." The article, just 6 sentences long, described Sarah's disappearance and recovery in optimistic, superficial terms. What the article didn't mention, what couldn't yet be known, was that by the time those words were printed, Sarah Miller had already stopped eating solid food, and the town's children had already begun falling ill. The first sign that something was wrong came from the Miller household itself, though it would be days before the rest of Dust Creek learned of it. Eleanor Miller, in a letter to her sister that was never sent, found crumpled in her writing desk years later, described the morning of December 12th, just 1 day after Sarah's return. "She will not eat," Eleanor wrote, her handwriting increasingly erratic across the page. "I prepared her favorite breakfast, eggs and bacon, fresh bread with butter and honey. She sat at the table and stared at it as if I had placed a plate of stones before her. When I insisted, she grew agitated, pushed the plate away, said it made her feel sick. Thomas said to give her time, that her stomach needed to recover from the ordeal. But sister, the way she looked at that food, it was not the look of a sick child. It was the look of disgust, of revulsion, as if we were asking her to eat something dead." Dr. Whitmore's medical log from December 13th provides clinical detail. Examined Sarah Miller at the family's request. Patient appears physically recovered from exposure, though unusually lethargic and pale. Parents report she has consumed no solid food since her return, accepting only water and, oddly, raw milk directly from the cow. Patient complains of stomach pain when offered normal meals. Prescribed bland diet and rest. Parents seem overly anxious, understandable given the recent trauma. But by December 14th, Whitmore's tone had changed. Second examination of Sarah Miller. Patient has lost noticeable weight in just 3 days. Skin has taken on an almost translucent quality. Blue veins visible at temples and wrists. Parents report she has begun sleeping during the day and becomes active only after sunset. When I attempted examination near the window, patient recoiled from the winter sunlight streaming through, claiming it hurt her eyes. have seen photosensitivity in patients with certain conditions, but never to this degree. Most troubling, patients' canine teeth appear slightly elongated, likely an optical illusion or peculiarity I had not previously noticed. Recommended continued observation. The Millers, desperate to maintain normalcy, sent Sarah back to school on December 16th. Miss Caroline Porter's account, given years later to a journalist investigating the case, remains one of the most disturbing testimonies on record. Sarah arrived late after the morning bell, Porter recalled. She stood in the doorway, and I remember thinking how thin she had become, how the sunlight from the windows seemed to make her squint and turn away. I gave her her seat near the back, away from the windows, as she requested. The other children, who had been so excited to see her return, grew quiet. You know how children can sense things adults cannot? They kept their distance. During the noon meal, Sarah sat apart. She had brought nothing to eat. When little Emma Schmidt offered to share her sandwich, Sarah looked at it with such strange intensity that Emma actually pulled back, frightened. "I'm not hungry for that," Sarah said. Just those words, but the way she said them, the emphasis on that, as if she was hungry for something else entirely. That afternoon, during arithmetic lessons, I noticed Sarah staring at young Thomas Burke, not at his face but at his neck, just staring, unblinking, for minutes at a time. When I called her name, she startled as if waking from a trance. I dismissed the children early that day. I told myself it was because of the cold, but truthfully, I could not bear the atmosphere in that room any longer. The next report came from Friedrich Braun, who operated the town's small dairy. His statement to Pastor Hayes, recorded in the pastor's journal dated December 18th, describes an encounter that sent the first real ripples of fear through Dust Creek. "I found the girl in my barn before dawn," Braun reported. "She was standing in the stall with Greta, my best milk cow. At first I thought she was stealing milk and I was angry, but when I lit my lantern and saw her clearly, I forgot my anger. She was drinking directly from the cow, not from a pail, but from the teat itself, like a calf. But that wasn't the worst of it, Pastor. Greta was trembling, her eyes rolling white with fear, and the girl, when she turned to look at me, her mouth was red. Too red, and Greta's udder, it was bleeding, small punctures, like she had bitten it. The girl ran past me and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. When I examined Greta properly, I found she had lost a significant amount of blood. Dr. Whitmore was called to examine the cow. His log entry is brief but telling. Examined Braun's cow, puncture wounds consistent with human bite. Unusual drainage of blood, more than expected from such small wounds. Braun insists Sarah Miller responsible. Have agreed to speak with the family. But before Whitmore could visit the Miller farm, a new development shifted the town's concern from one strange child to a potential epidemic. On December 19th, 3 children who attended school with Sarah fell ill with identical symptoms: severe lethargy, extreme paleness, loss of appetite, and small, unexplained wounds on their necks and wrists. The first was Emma Schmidt, age 7, who had tried to share her lunch with Sarah. Her mother, Margaret, brought her to Dr. Whitmore in a state of panic. "She has been marked," Margaret insisted, her German accent thickening with emotion. "Look, at her neck, Herr Doctor. 2 small marks, like bee stings, but they will not heal. She grows weaker by the hour." Whitmore's examination found exactly what Margaret described. 2 small puncture wounds on the left side of Emma's neck, slightly inflamed, with unusual bruising around them. The pattern was distinctive, unmistakable. The spacing matched that of human canine teeth. By December 20th, 2 more children, Thomas Burke and little Anna Weber, presented with the same marks and symptoms. All 3 children had been in close proximity to Sarah Miller within the previous week. All three sets of parents made the connection immediately. Pastor Hayes called an emergency town meeting at the church on the evening of December 20th. His journal describes the atmosphere. "Never have I seen such fear in the faces of my congregation. Mothers clutched their children. Men whispered of things I thought we had left behind in the old country. The word was spoken, though I tried to silence it. Vampire, the old superstition, the ancient fear, brought across the ocean and planted here in American soil." The meeting quickly devolved into chaos. Some demanded that Sarah be examined by Dr. Whitmore and Pastor Hayes together. Others insisted she be isolated from the other children immediately. A few, their voices rising above the others, suggested more extreme measures, though Hayes refused to record the specific proposals in his journal. Thomas Miller, defending his daughter, grew increasingly desperate. "She is a child," he shouted, according to multiple accounts, "a sick child who has suffered a terrible ordeal. You speak of demons and curses, but have any of you considered that there might be a rational explanation, that my Sarah might be the victim of some disease we don't yet understand?" It was a reasonable argument, and Dr. Whitmore supported it, but reason had little power against the evidence accumulating in Dust Creek, and that evidence was about to become impossible to ignore. On the morning of December 21st, Friedrich Braun found his dog dead in the yard, completely drained of blood. 2 hours later, the Schmidt family discovered their barn cat in the same condition. By noon, 5 more families reported livestock, pets with identical wounds. That same terrible drainage, that same appearance of having been systematically exsanguinated. And on each property, in the snow around the dead animals, witnesses reported seeing small footprints. The footprints of a child. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is Sarah Miller suffering from some rare medical condition that medicine in 1912 simply couldn't understand? Or had something else, something ancient and hungry, come back from those woods wearing Sarah's face? The crisis reached its breaking point on December 22nd, when Dr. Henry Whitmore, accompanied by Pastor Jonathan Hayes and Thomas Miller, conducted what would become known in local legend as the examination. The event was documented by all 3 men in their respective journals, and while their accounts differ in tone, they align disturbingly in detail. The examination took place in Dr. Whitmore's office at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Eleanor Miller had reluctantly agreed to bring Sarah, though she insisted on remaining present throughout. The winter sun, pale and weak, streamed through the office's single window. According to Whitmore's medical log, Sarah reacted immediately upon entering the room. "Patient displayed extreme photophobia," Whitmore wrote. "Even the weak December sunlight caused her visible distress. She covered her face with her hands and retreated to the darkest corner of the room. I was forced to draw the curtains completely before she would cooperate with the examination." With the room darkened and lamplight providing minimal illumination, Whitmore began his assessment. What he discovered challenged everything his medical training had taught him. Sarah's temperature was abnormally low, registering at just 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Her pulse was slow, barely 50 beats per minute, yet regular. Her skin had taken on an almost luminescent pallor, the veins visible beneath like dark rivers on a pale map. But it was Sarah's mouth that provided the most disturbing evidence. Pastor Hayes, in his journal, described the moment with obvious distress. Dr. Whitmore asked the child to open her mouth. She was reluctant, and her mother had to coax her gently. When at last she complied, we all saw it clearly. Her canine teeth had elongated, not dramatically, but unmistakably. They were perhaps a quarter-inch longer than they should be, and they came to distinctly sharp points. I have seen many things in my 18 years serving this community, but I have never seen human teeth transform in such a manner. Whitmore, attempting to maintain scientific objectivity, proposed multiple theories. A rare genetic condition, some form of Hypertrichosis affecting the teeth, a disease encountered in the forest that affected bone growth. Thomas Miller seized on these explanations desperately. Eleanor simply wept. The examination was interrupted by a commotion outside. Young Timothy Walsh, aged 9, had been found unconscious behind the church, 2 fresh puncture wounds on his neck, his skin as pale as snow. He was the 4th child to be marked. The connection was undeniable. Timothy had been part of a group of children who had gone to visit Sarah the previous evening, bringing her a small Christmas gift. Within 12 hours he had collapsed. Dr. Whitmore rushed to treat the boy, administering stimulants and trying to understand the mechanism of this strange affliction. In his log, he noted, Timothy's blood appeared unusually thin, almost watery. The volume seemed adequate, yet he presented with all signs of severe anemia. I can find no medical explanation for the rapid onset of these symptoms. That evening, as Timothy Walsh hovered between consciousness and delirium in Dr. Whitmore's office, Sarah Miller disappeared from her family's home. Thomas and Eleanor woke in the pre-dawn hours of December 23rd to find her bed empty, her window open, fresh snow blowing into the room. In the snow outside, her small footprints led toward the forest, but this time they were not alone. Other tracks accompanied hers, deeper, larger, suggesting she had not walked into the woods alone, or perhaps suggesting that something had come to collect her. The search party that formed on December 23rd was different from the one that had sought Sarah 11 days earlier. This time, the men carried more than lanterns and rope. Several carried rifles. Others brought crosses, hastily fashioned from barn wood. Friedrich Braun insisted on bringing garlic and silver, old-world remedies against old-world evils. Dr. Whitmore protested these superstitions, but even he carried a Bible given to him by Pastor Hayes. The tracks led deep into the forest, following a path that seemed to wind deliberately, as if whoever made them knew exactly where they were going. After 3 miles, the search party reached a part of the woods that even the most experienced hunters avoided. The trees grew twisted here, their branches reaching toward each other like grasping fingers. The snow lay thinner beneath the dense canopy, and the air itself seemed heavier, harder to breathe. It was Johann Schmidt, Eleanor's cousin, and an experienced trapper who found the entrance. A narrow opening in a limestone outcropping, partially hidden by fallen timber and overgrown vines that somehow remained green despite the killing cold. The opening was just large enough for a child to enter easily, or an adult to squeeze through with difficulty. Inside, the limestone cave extended back into darkness. The search party lit torches, and what they discovered in that firelight would haunt Dust Creek for generations. Pastor Hayes's journal entry from that night is nearly illegible, his handwriting shaking across the page. We found a chamber, perhaps 20 feet wide, the walls weeping with moisture. The floor was covered in something dark, which we realized with horror was dried blood. Animal bones lay scattered everywhere, some fresh, some ancient, but it was what we found at the back of the chamber that stole our voices and our courage. A crude altar, made from stacked stones, and upon that altar a collection of items that spoke of ritual and purpose. More bones, carefully arranged, small cloth dolls, handmade, each bearing a child's name stitched in crude letters, and a leather journal, water-damaged but partially legible, filled with symbols I did not recognize, and words in a language that predated English. Dr. Whitmore examined the journal by torchlight. The entries were fragmentary, written in what appeared to be a mixture of German and an older dialect he couldn't identify. The dates he could make out ranged from the 1780s to the 1840s. One passage, translated later by a professor of Germanic languages from the University of Missouri, read, "The child is prepared. The hunger will pass through her as it passed through us. The community will feed the darkness, or the darkness will feed upon the community. This is the covenant made when we disturb the burial ground. This is the price of our settlement. The implications were staggering. Dust Creek had been built, the searchers now realized, on land that had served as a burial site, but for whom? The earliest white settlers had arrived in 1847. Who had been buried here before? The journal suggested that the German founders knew they were building on sacred or cursed ground and had perhaps made some terrible bargain to do so. But Sarah was not in the cave. Her footprints, examined carefully, led into the chamber and then simply stopped, as if she had vanished into the stone walls themselves. The search party spent hours examining every inch of the cave, looking for hidden passages or additional chambers. They found nothing. Sarah Miller had entered the cave and ceased to exist within it. Or so they believed, until they returned to town and learned what had happened in their absence. While the search party combed the forest, Dust Creek experienced its darkest night. Mrs. Helena Adler, the elderly widow who lived alone on the western edge of town, reported hearing scratching at her windows after midnight. When she peered through the curtains, she saw a small figure in a white nightgown standing in her yard, barely visible in the falling snow. The figure was watching her house with unwavering attention. "I knew it was the Miller child," Mrs. Adler told Pastor Hayes the next morning. "I don't know how I knew, but I was certain. She stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, not moving, not calling out, just watching. And Pastor, this is the part you must believe. I saw others with her, shapes in the darkness, too tall to be, children, too still to be human. They surrounded my house, circling it like wolves around prey. I prayed until dawn, and when the sun rose, they were gone." Similar reports came from 3 other households. In each case, the witnesses described seeing Sarah, always accompanied by shadowy figures, always watching, always silent. The Schmidt family barricaded their doors and windows, terrified that their daughter Emma, still weak from her mysterious affliction, would be taken next. But the most significant event of that night occurred at the church. Pastor Hayes had left the building unlocked, as was his custom, so that any member of the community could enter to pray at any hour. When he arrived at dawn to prepare for the Christmas Eve service planned for the following evening, he found the sanctuary desecrated. The crosses had been torn from the walls and thrown into a pile in the center of the aisle. The Bible on the altar lay open, its pages ripped and scattered. And on the floor, written in what appeared to be animal blood, was a message in crude, childish handwriting: "We are hungry." Most disturbing of all was what Hayes found in the church basement, where the community stored food donations for struggling families. The locked door had been torn open, the heavy wooden beams snapped like kindling. Inside, every container of preserved meat had been opened and emptied. Jars of pickled vegetables lay untouched. Sacks of flour and grain remained sealed. But every source of animal protein, every jar of preserved meat, every cured ham had been consumed entirely. The search party returned at midday to find the town in a state of siege. Families had locked themselves in their homes. Dr. Whitmore's office was crowded with people demanding protection, explanations, solutions. The children who had been marked by Sarah grew weaker by the hour. Little Emma Schmidt had stopped speaking entirely, lying in her bed with her eyes open, staring at nothing. And then, as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon, Sarah Miller walked back into town. She emerged from the tree line at 4 o'clock, just as the December darkness began to gather. She wore the same torn nightgown, now stained with mud and what appeared to be blood. She walked calmly down the main street, her bare feet leaving small prints in the snow, seemingly unbothered by the cold that had killed grown men. When she reached her family's home, she knocked on the door, just as she had 11 days earlier. But this time her parents did not answer. Thomas Miller stood behind the locked door, his hunting rifle in his hands, and called out to his daughter through the wood, "Sarah, if you are still my Sarah, if you are still my little girl, tell me what you said on your 5th birthday when I gave you the doll with the red dress." There was a long silence. Then Sarah's voice, unchanged, still the voice of an 8-year-old child. "I said I would name her Rose, like Mama's garden. Roses. Papa, I'm cold. Please let me in." It was the right answer. Only Sarah would have known that detail. Thomas lowered his rifle, his hand moving toward the doorbolt. But Eleanor stopped him. "Ask her something else," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Ask her something only our Sarah would know." Before Thomas could speak again, Sarah answered a question that had not been asked. "Mama made me promise never to tell anyone about the thing she keeps in the cellar. The thing in the jar that she uses for her special remedies. The thing that looks like a baby, but isn't quite right." Eleanor gasped. It was true. She had preserved a malformed stillbirth, one of her lost children, keeping it in formaldehyde to study for her herbal medicine work. She had shown it to Sarah once, years ago, and made her promise never to speak of it. No one else knew, not even Thomas. This was Sarah, or something that had access to Sarah's memories, Sarah's voice, Sarah's knowledge. The distinction in that moment became terrifyingly unclear. Thomas opened the door. What happened in the Miller house that night remains one of the most disputed aspects of the Dust Creek case. The family's testimony, given to Pastor Hayes and Dr. Whitmore the following morning, Christmas Eve, conflicts with physical evidence found at the scene. But one thing is certain. By dawn, on December 24th, 1912, Thomas and Eleanor Miller were dead, and Sarah Miller had vanished once again, this time taking with her a small leather-bound book, her diary, the one piece of evidence that might explain everything. And the town's children, all 4 who had been marked, fell into comas from which they would never wake. The official record of what happened in Dust Creek ends on Christmas Day, 1912. The county sheriff, summoned by telegraph once the roads cleared in late January, found a town in ruins. Thomas and Eleanor Miller were buried in unmarked graves. The 4 children who had fallen into comas, Emma Schmidt, Thomas Burke, Anna Weber and Timothy Walsh, died within days of each other in early January. Pastor Jonathan Hayes had suffered a complete mental breakdown and was committed to the state lunatic asylum in Fulton, where he died in 1915, still insisting that demons walked the earth. Dr. Henry Whitmore closed his practice and left Missouri entirely, relocating to California where he lived under an assumed name until his death in 1934. His medical logs and personal journals were discovered in a storage unit in San Diego in 1982, purchased at auction by a medical historian who recognized their significance. The town of Dust Creek itself slowly died. Families moved away. Farms were abandoned. Buildings collapsed under the weight of successive winters. By 1930, Dust Creek had ceased to exist as a functioning community. By 1950, it had been erased from most maps. The forest reclaimed what remained, but the story, as stories do, refused to die. In the spring of 1956, Professor Edmund Blackwell, a historian from the University of Missouri specializing in frontier settlements, stumbled upon a reference to Dust Creek while researching German immigration patterns in the Ozarks. Intrigued by the town's complete disappearance from records after 1913, he organized a small archaeological survey of the site. What Blackwell's team found was documented in a paper published in the Missouri Historical Review in 1957, though the journal editors notably removed several sections they deemed too sensational and unsupported by evidence. Blackwell's original field notes, preserved in the university archives, tell a more complete story. The team excavated the ruins of the Miller farmhouse first. Beneath the collapsed structure, they discovered a root cellar that had been sealed, apparently from the inside. When they broke through the rotted door, they found the skeletal remains of two adults, confirmed through dental records to be Thomas and Eleanor Miller. But the positioning of the remains troubled Blackwell. The skeletons were huddled together in the farthest corner of the cellar, their arms wrapped around each other. The door had not been sealed to keep something out, but to keep themselves in. More disturbing were the marks found on the cellar walls, deep scratches, as if something had been trying to claw through the stone, and written repeatedly in charcoal, in Eleanor's handwriting according to samples Blackwell had obtained. "She cannot come in unless we invite her. She cannot come in unless we invite her." Hundreds of repetitions, covering every available surface. In the church basement, Blackwell's team found a wooden chest that had been hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by various townspeople in the days following Sarah's return. The letters had never been mailed, apparently confiscated by someone who wanted to contain the story. One letter, written by Miss Caroline Porter to her sister, in Kansas City, contained a detail that Blackwell found particularly haunting. "I have learned something terrible. Old Mrs. Adler, before she fled town, told me that her grandmother was part of the original settlement in 1847. She said the Germans who founded Dust Creek knew they were building on an ancient burial ground, that they found stone markers and remains when they first broke ground. But the land was cheap, and they were desperate. According to her grandmother, they made a pact with something they found in a cave in the forest, protection from disease and hardship in exchange for a tribute paid every 65 years. 1847 plus 65 years equals 1912, Caroline. The year Sarah disappeared. The year everything went wrong. What if the tribute was supposed to be a child? What if Sarah wasn't taken but offered? Blackwell attempted to follow up on this claim, but could find no surviving members of the original settlement families willing to speak with him. The few descendants he located refused interviews or denied any knowledge of their ancestors' history in Dust Creek. 21 years after Blackwell's excavation, a woman named Margaret Hayes appeared at the Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City. She was 78 years old, the granddaughter of Pastor Jonathan Hayes. She carried with her a metal box that had been hidden in her family's attic for 6 decades. Inside the box were Pastor Hayes's complete journals from December 1912, far more detailed than the edited versions held in the Historical Society. Also included was a letter written by Hayes during his final days in the asylum, addressed to "whoever finds this after I am gone." The archivist who received Margaret Hayes that day, Robert Chen, later wrote about the experience. Mrs. Hayes was clearly distressed, torn between a desire to finally reveal the truth and fear of what revealing it might mean. She told me that her father had made her promise never to open the box, never to read what was inside, but she was dying of cancer, and she could not bear the thought of taking the secret to her grave. Pastor Hayes's asylum letter, now available to researchers with special permission, contains claims that strain credulity. He wrote that on Christmas Eve 1912, he had returned to the cave in the forest alone, determined to understand what had happened to Sarah. Inside the cave, he claimed to have found Sarah's diary lying open on the stone altar. He transcribed several pages of the diary into his letter. The entries, if genuine, are deeply disturbing. They begin normally enough, describing Sarah's daily life in the weeks before her disappearance. But the final entries, dated during the 3 days she was missing, tell a different story. December 9th. I am in the cave. I don't remember how I got here, but I am not alone. They say they have been waiting for me. They say I am the payment. They say I will become like them and then I can go home, but I won't be me anymore. I'm scared. December 10th. It doesn't hurt anymore. I can hear them in my head now. They show me pictures of Dust Creek, of everyone I know. They're so hungry. They've been hungry for so long. They say if I bring them what they need, they'll let Mama and Papa live. I said yes. I had to say yes. December 11th. I don't want to be this. I don't want to hurt people. But I'm so hungry now too. They put something in me, something old and dark and always hungry. When I go home today, I won't really be going home. I'll be bringing the hunger with me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Pastor Hayes claimed that after reading the diary, he burned it, unable to bear the thought of anyone else reading Sarah's final words. Whether this is true, or whether the diary still exists somewhere, hidden or destroyed, remains unknown. The final piece of the Dust Creek puzzle emerged in 1984, when a team from the Smithsonian Institution conducted a comprehensive survey of pre-Columbian sites in Missouri. Using ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the area where Dust Creek had once stood. What they found beneath the town site shocked the archaeological community. An extensive network of burial chambers dating back approximately 800 years, belonging to an unknown indigenous culture. The burial practices documented in these chambers were unlike anything seen in other Mississippian or Osage sites in the region. The remains showed signs of systematic blood drainage before the burial. Grave goods included items associated with death rituals, but also feeding vessels and ceremonial knives. Most significant were stone carvings found throughout the chambers, depicting figures with elongated teeth, consuming what appeared to be blood or other fluids. Dr. Susan Yamamoto, the lead archaeologist, wrote in her preliminary report, "We are looking at evidence of a death cult, possibly related to beliefs about sustaining the dead or preventing the dead from rising. The settlers of 1847 built their town directly on top of what appears to have been a ceremonial center dedicated to controlling or appeasing something these ancient people feared. Whether that fear was based on superstition or actual experience with a disease or condition we don't yet understand is unclear, but the evidence suggests they took the threat very seriously." The site was sealed by the federal government in 1985, officially due to concerns about structural instability. Unofficially, according to documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 2003, there were incidents during the excavation. 3 members of the archaeological team reported experiencing vivid nightmares and severe anemia that cleared up only after they left the site. One researcher claimed to have seen a child in a white nightgown watching the excavation from the tree line, though no children lived in the area and a search found no one. The Smithsonian's complete findings remain classified to this day. So what really happened in Dust Creek, Missouri, in the winter of 1912? What walked out of those woods wearing Sarah Miller's face? And perhaps most disturbingly, is it still out there somewhere, waiting for the next tribute to come due? The theories, as you might expect, are as numerous as they are contradictory. The first theory, favored by medical historians, suggests that Sarah contracted a rare blood disorder during her time in the forest, porphyria, a genetic condition that can cause extreme photosensitivity, dental abnormalities, and even psychiatric symptoms, has been proposed as an explanation. The condition can be triggered by environmental factors and can explain many of Sarah's symptoms. The deaths of the other children could be attributed to a combination of disease transmission and mass hysteria, amplified by the isolated, superstitious nature of the community. The violent deaths of Thomas and Eleanor Miller might have been a murder-suicide driven by the unbearable psychological pressure of their situation. This theory is neat, rational, and requires no supernatural explanation, but it fails to account for several troubling details. How did Sarah survive 3 days and nights in temperatures that should have killed her within hours? What explains the systematic blood drainage from animals across multiple properties? And most problematically, what about the ancient burial site beneath the town, with its 800-year-old carvings depicting figures that match the descriptions of what Sarah became? The second theory, embraced by paranormal researchers, takes a darker view. They suggest that Dust Creek was built on a location where the boundary between our world and something else has always been thin. The indigenous people who created that burial site 8 centuries ago knew about this weakness in reality and developed rituals to contain or control whatever existed on the other side. When the German settlers disturbed the site in 1847, they broke those protections. Their pact, mentioned in the letters, was a desperate attempt to renegotiate terms with an entity they didn't understand. Sarah was the payment, transformed into a vessel for something ancient and eternally hungry. This theory accounts for more of the evidence, but requires accepting that reality is far stranger and more terrible than science allows. A third theory, less often discussed but perhaps most disturbing, suggests that everything that happened in Dust Creek was entirely human in origin, that Sarah's trauma in the forest, whatever its nature, triggered a psychotic break, that Eleanor Miller, desperate to save her daughter, began using her knowledge of herbs and folk medicine to create concoctions that had unexpected psychological effects on the children, that the deaths were murders covered up by a community conspiracy and rewritten into legend to protect guilty parties, that the ancient burial site is real but coincidental, that we see monsters because looking at human evil is simply too painful. But then, how do we explain what happened in 1956 and 1973 and 1984? How do we explain the reports that continue to emerge from the area where Dust Creek once stood? Hikers who report seeing a pale child in the forest, always at dusk, always watching. Metal detectorists who claim to find small items, toys and buttons and hair ribbons that date from the early 20th century, scattered along paths that lead nowhere. And most troubling of all, the handful of missing person cases from the surrounding counties, spanning decades, all sharing certain commonalities. Victims who disappeared during winter, whose bodies, when found, showed unusual blood loss, who were last seen near the forests of eastern Missouri. Local law enforcement denies any connection between these cases. The Missouri State Police official position is that the Dust Creek incident was a localized tragedy exacerbated by isolation and disease, and that any modern reports of unusual activity in the area are either hoaxes or misidentifications of natural phenomena. But in the small communities that ring the area where Dust Creek once stood, there are families who won't let their children play in the forest after dark. There are hunters who refuse to track game into certain valleys. There are locals who cross themselves when they drive past the unmarked turnoff where the old road to Dust Creek used to begin. And on December nights, when the temperature drops and the snow begins to fall, doors are locked and curtains are drawn, not against human intruders, but against something else. Something that might look like a lost child, might speak with a child's voice, might know things only the child could know, but something that is no longer, if it ever was, entirely human. The truth about Sarah Miller and Dust Creek remains buried, perhaps literally, beneath a century of silence and snow. Whether that truth is medical, supernatural, or something we don't yet have words to describe, we may never know with certainty. To this day, no one knows the truth. And perhaps some truths are better left in the darkness where they belong. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Missouri's most haunting mysteries. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the forgotten corners of American history. Leave a comment below with your theory about what really happened in Dust Creek. Was Sarah a victim of disease, a supernatural entity, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts with our haunted community. Until next time, remember, not all stories have happy endings, and some stories never truly end at all. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe out there.